Welcome to another deep dive. We're excited you're here. You sent us your sources, and now we're going to take those and give you a crash course on, well, whatever it is that you want to learn about.
We take all those sources, boil them down, and extract all those crucial insights, so you can be well informed. And it doesn't take forever.
Exactly. You'll walk away from this deep dive, hopefully, with some real aha moments, some new perspectives, and a solid understanding without getting bogged down in too much detail.
Right. Just the good stuff.
Exactly. And for today's deep dive, we are going to be diving into Tim Marshall's Prisoners of Geography. Specifically, we're going to be focusing on how, well, the physical world, right? The mountains, rivers, deserts, and seas, how all of that fundamentally shapes the decisions, the choices that are made by world leaders. And we really want to make this deep dive valuable for you, our listener. We know you want to learn quickly, but you also want that depth. You appreciate those multiple perspectives, right?
Yeah, and you want to have those aha moments. Those are the best.
Exactly. You want to have that deep understanding without feeling like you're drowning in information.
Yeah.
And that's what we're aiming for here. So we're going to explore this often kind of underappreciated power of geography.
Yeah.
And I'm not talking about just, the land itself, but the climate, the demographics, the resources, and how all of that influences, well, everything.
It's a lot.
Everything from like international relations to, national politics to even the very fabric of societies. It really is a force that's like always at play, whether we realize it or not.
Always at play. Under the surface.
Yeah. Okay. Let's start unpacking some of this. I think we often hear like, oh, we're living in these like uniquely turbulent times, right? The future is more uncertain than ever. It's a very common narrative these days.
Right. Super common narrative, doom and gloom, the end is nigh, that kind of thing.
Right. Everything's unprecedented. But the book kind of encourages us to be a little bit skeptical of that, right? Like history is full of these, unpredictable periods.
Yeah, history rhymes, as they say.
Right.
But the thing is, though, Marshall, he doesn't totally dismiss the idea that things are changing. He acknowledges that there are these like massive shifts happening all over the place. We're talking economics, we're talking social stuff, demographics, technology. Like this stuff has global implications.
Right. Yeah. Things are changing, that's for sure.
Totally. But the book's main point is like, even with all this modern change, the land itself, it's always been there.
It's not going anywhere.
It's not going anywhere. Right. Like, think about it. Wars, empires rising and falling, political systems, how societies develop, like all of that, it has deep roots in geography.
Yeah, like so much of human history makes a lot more sense when you look at it through that lens,
You start to see the patterns.
Yeah.
And the thing is, even though like, planes and the internet and all that, it makes the world feel smaller. Like, distances don't really matter anymore.
Right.
We kind of forget, like, the land is still there. It's still shaping things.
Is that constant factor, right?
Yeah, totally. It's like the decisions that billions of people are making, still influenced by where they are in the world.
And it's also crucial to remember that no single geographic factor is like universally dominant.
It's not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing.
Right. Mountains might be super important in one place, while deserts or rivers, like, those might matter more somewhere else. It really depends.
Location, location, location.
Exactly. So this is where we get to this concept of geopolitics, which is essentially like, trying to understand international affairs through the lens of all these geographic elements, right?
It's like looking at the world map and thinking, okay, how does this mountain range or this river or even this desert, how does that shape the way countries interact with each other?
Yeah, exactly. And it's not just the physical terrain either, right?
Yep.
It's also about like climate and population and, where the resources and like even cultural zones, right?
Yeah, all those things together, that's what geopolitics is all about.
Right. And it's fascinating because these aren't just some abstract concepts. They have real-world consequences.
Yeah.
They influence everything from, military strategy and political alliances to like the evolution of languages and where the trade routes are and even, how religions spread.
It's all connected, man.
It really is. But here's the thing, and the book makes this point really well. A lot of times we underestimate the role of, that physical geography.
People don't give it enough credit.
Right. Both in historical accounts and like, in the news, even today. The book argues that like geography isn't just some backdrop.
It's not just the stage, it's part of the play.
It's part of the story.
It's a character.
Yeah. It's a fundamental part of the why behind the what, And maybe it's not the only factor, but it's definitely one that's consistently undervalued, I think.
Totally agree. People focus on the political stuff, the personalities, but they forget about the mountains and the rivers and the deserts. Those things don't change as fast.
Okay, let's get into some specifics here. Let's talk about some examples that illustrate this. So consider China and India for a second.
Hmm.
These are two of the world's most populous nations, right?
Hmm.
Sharing a massive border.
Huge border.
You would think that there'd be a lot of conflict there.
Yeah, you'd think they'd be fighting all the time.
Right. You would think there'd be a lot of major wars.
Yeah.
But the reality is quite different. Apart from a brief border conflict back in 1962, they haven't really had any major military engagements. And that's because of, guess what?
Geography.
Geography. The Himalayas. It's like this giant wall between them. The book uses a phrase I really like. It calls it a practically insurmountable obstacle to large military movements.
It's like trying to invade Russia in the winter. Just a terrible idea.
Right. So you got these two superpowers, and they're kind of forced to, they have to prioritize other solutions, right?
They gotta play nice.
Yeah, play nice, right?
Or at least find other ways to compete. Like they focus on economics, trying to influence their neighbors, stuff like that.
Yeah. And it's not like there's no tension there. There's plenty. But geography just makes large-scale war a really, really bad option.
Makes you think. Huh.
It does. And let's talk about another example of how this geography stuff really matters. I was in northern Afghanistan shortly after 9/11, actually.
Oh, wow, really?
Yeah, I was embedded with Northern Alliance troops who were fighting the Taliban.
Wow.
And at that time, we had all this, we had the best technology. America had satellite surveillance and all this fancy stuff. But guess what? The climate had a huge impact on what was even possible.
I'm guessing it wasn't the sunshine and rainbows that people picture when they think of Afghanistan.
No, not exactly. It rained. And it was like this incredible downpour. And all of a sudden, all of that, that dry sand, it turned into mud. Thick,
Oh.
thick mud.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah. I mean, it was unbelievable. And all of a sudden, that sophisticated satellite technology, it was useless. I mean, nobody could move. Forget about fighting. Nobody could even, get around.
So, even with all our fancy tech, we're still stuck dealing with mud.
Ugh.
It's kind of funny when you think about it.
Yeah, it is. And, it really was a stark reminder that the basic rules of geography, the ones that, ancient leaders had to deal with, they still matter. Even with all our technology, nature still calls the shots sometimes.
It's humbling, isn't it?
It is. It's quite humbling.
Yeah.
All right, moving on. The book draws this interesting contrast between Japan and Korea.
Yeah.
Both are, pretty ethnically homogenous, but they face these really different geographical challenges.
Yeah, Japan, island nation, right. Not a lot of space and definitely not a lot of natural resources. So
Right.
they've had to be really smart about how they use what they've got and how they deal with other countries.
And Korea, on the other hand, well, they've got this unresolved issue of their division, a problem that's deeply rooted in, both geography and history.
Divided country, always a tough situation.
Yeah. And then you've got Latin America,
Hmm.
which it also faces its own unique geographical limitations.
Latin America, man, so much potential, but geography has kind of dealt them a tough hand,
Yeah, explain that a little.
Well, the distances in the far south, it's a long way from everything else, makes global trade a real pain. And then you've got all that challenging terrain within the continent itself, mountains, jungles, deserts, makes it really hard to build a unified, strong economy.
Right. It's hard to have a European Union type situation.
Exactly. You've got the Andes, right? Huge mountain range, cuts right through South America, makes it tough for countries like Chile and Argentina to really connect.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense.
It's like nature itself is drawing borders.
So these geographical realities, they kind of force these countries to think differently about their economies and their relationships with each other.
It's like they're playing a different game down there.
Yeah. Then you got the Arctic. For most of human history, it's been pretty much ignored.
Yeah, the Arctic, the frozen wasteland, nobody cared about it for centuries. Too cold, too remote.
Right. But then in the 20th century, we started discovering all this oil and gas up there, and suddenly the Arctic's become this hot spot.
Pun intended.
Maybe. But, it's true. All these countries are now scrambling to claim territory, to secure those resources. It's like this new frontier for geopolitical competition.
Yeah, the new great game, they call it.
Okay. Let's talk about Russia. I mean, this is This is a country whose identity and whose actions, everything they do, it's just profoundly shaped by geography.
Russia, man, it's like a world unto itself. Seriously, just look at the size of this place. It spans across two continents, Europe and Asia. I mean, you could get on a train in Moscow and like 6 days later, you'd still be in Russia.
That's wild.
6 days on a train just to cross one country, that's going to shape your worldview, you know?
It has to.
So when you're a leader in Russia, you can't just think about one city, one region. You got to think about all these different areas, all these different people, all spread out over thousands of miles.
Right. You got to think big.
You got to think big. And historically, they've focused westward.
Right, because of Europe.
Exactly. Europe's right there. It's always been this like mix of opportunity and threat for Russia.
Right. It's both a source of like cultural influence and a place where, they've been invaded from multiple times.
They're complicated.
It is. And the book quotes Churchill's famous line about Russia, a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma.
Classic Churchill.
Right. But it's important to remember the rest of that sentence. Churchill goes on to say, but perhaps there is a key. That key is Russian national interest.
Okay, that's a good point. So if we want to understand Russia, we got to figure out what their national interest is. And how does geography play into that?
Right. And geography is like a huge part of that national interest. I mean, its size alone has been a huge defensive advantage, especially in the Far East.
The Far East, yeah. It's like Siberia, right. Endless forests, frozen wastelands.
Right. It's just vast and empty and harsh.
Not exactly an inviting place to invade. Like, even if you did manage to conquer it, what would you even do with it?
Right. What would you do with it?
There's not much there to exploit, at least not easily.
Right. So it's like this natural buffer zone. It's hard to attack and even harder to hold on to.
Makes you wonder if that's why Russia's been able to hold on to such a massive land empire for so long.
It's got to be a factor, right?
Yeah. But while the East is pretty secure, the West has always been a problem.
Yeah. Over the centuries, Russia's been invaded from the West so many times.
Like a revolving door of invaders. You've got the Poles, the Swedes, Napoleon.
And the Germans.
Twice.
Twice.
In both world wars.
It's no wonder they're a little paranoid.
A little. I think they have a right to be. That North European plain, it's like a giant highway straight to Moscow. No natural barriers. So, yeah, they're going to be sensitive about that.
And that history really shapes their outlook on the world, right?
Absolutely. It's like they're always looking over their shoulder, waiting for the next attack.
Makes sense. And historically, the core of Russia was it was this huge ring around Moscow, wasn't it?
A huge ring. I like that. It's like a fortress.
It was. It went from the Arctic down through the Baltics, Ukraine, the Black Sea, the Caucasus, the Caspian, and then back up to the Urals. And then the Soviet Union came along, and they basically just expanded that ring even further.
The USSR, the Russian Empire 2.0.
Yeah. They went from the Pacific all the way to Berlin.
It's wild. And all because of geography, right? This drive to secure their borders, to push out as far as possible, to create this massive buffer zone.
It's all about security, really.
Totally.
But this huge size, it comes with some contradictions, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Like, it's the biggest country in the world by landmass, but its population is actually pretty small.
Really? Smaller than the U.S.?
Way smaller. And it's spread out over this huge area. So even though they have all this land, it's not like they can easily use it all. Like, their growing season is short in a lot of places.
Yeah.
And distributing resources, forget about it. It's a logistical nightmare.
Yeah.
And then there's the whole identity thing. Like, are they European? Are they Asian?
They kind of straddle both of them.
Yeah. I mean, they border Europe, so obviously they've got a lot of European influence, but then they've got this huge chunk of land in Asia.
Siberia.
But Siberia is tough, man. Harsh climate, not a lot of people live there, and it's hard to get around. So they're not really Asian in the same way that, like, China or Japan are Asian.
Right. I always thought it was funny when Sarah Palin said you could see Russia from Alaska.
Ah, the classic Sarah Palin quote.
People made fun of her, but she wasn't wrong.
Nope, she wasn't. Those islands in the Bering Strait, they're pretty close.
They are. And it highlights that even if places seem really far apart, geography can still make them neighbors.
Absolutely. And speaking of neighbors, let's talk about Ukraine.
Oh, boy. Here we go.
Yeah, Ukraine. Super important to Russia. Like, really, really important.
It's that buffer zone, right? Protecting that North European plain we were talking about.
Exactly. And for Russia, Ukraine leaning towards the West. Big problem.
Joining NATO. A nightmare scenario for them.
Total nightmare. Because then NATO troops would be right on their border. And not just that, but they lose access to the Black Sea.
Right. They lose Sevastopol, their only warm water port.
Huge strategic loss.
Huge. And, it's easy for us in the West um, to not fully grasp, how seriously Russia takes this stuff.
I think there's a real lack of understanding in the West about how Russia sees the world.
I agree. We tend to view things through, our own lens,
Yeah.
and we forget that other countries have their own perspectives, their own history, their own anxieties.
And for Russia, Ukraine isn't just some random country. It's like part of their historical heartland. They see it as essential to their security.
So when they see Ukraine moving away from them and towards the West, it's like an existential threat.
Yeah, it's not just politics. It's emotional, it's historical, it's cultural. It's all tied up together.
And that brings us to Crimea, right?
Crimea, the peninsula that Russia took back in 2014.
Yeah. And that was a bold move.
Oh, super bold. But it made sense from their perspective.
Explain that.
Well, Ukraine was shifting away from Russia. They were getting closer to the EU, to NATO.
Right.
And Crimea has this huge Russian population, historical ties to Russia. Plus, it's home to Sevastopol, that crucial warm water port we talked about. So from Putin's point of view, he couldn't let Crimea go. It was too important.
He saw it as a red line.
Exactly. And he was willing to risk a lot to keep it. And he did. He rolled the dice, and it worked. The West didn't do much to stop him.
And the new Ukrainian government didn't exactly help matters, did they?
Yeah, their decision to get rid of Russian as an official language, big mistake.
Especially in those eastern regions where a lot of Russian speakers live.
It was like they were handing Putin a propaganda victory on a silver platter.
So Russia starts supporting these pro-Russian uprisings in eastern Ukraine, right?
Yeah, in places like Luhansk and Donetsk.
It was a way for them to exert influence without having to, go all in on a full-scale invasion.
Classic hybrid warfare. Stir up trouble, back your proxies, keep your opponent off balance. It's a lot cheaper than a full-blown war.
And it worked. They created this frozen conflict that they can manipulate to their advantage. And NATO, they responded by sending jets over the Baltics, doing some military exercises.
Showing the flag, trying to deter Russia. But it's a tough situation. Like, how far do you go? Do you risk a full-blown war over Ukraine?
Yeah, it's a really delicate balance.
Totally. And the crazy thing is, all of this could have been avoided if people had just paid more attention to geography.
You really think so?
I do.
Yeah.
Like, if the West had understood how important Ukraine is to Russia, they might have handled things differently.
Interesting. And it's not just about military force either, is it?
Nope. Russia has other weapons in its arsenal, like energy, gas and oil. They're a major energy supplier, especially to Europe.
Right.
And they use that leverage. They give better deals to countries they like. They put pressure on countries they don't.
So it's like an economic weapon.
Exactly. It's a way to reward your friends and punish your enemies. And Europe knows this, which is why they're trying to reduce their dependence on Russian energy.
By building more LNG terminals. Right.
Exactly. They want to be able to get their gas from other places so they're not so reliant on Russia. But it's a slow process.
And in the meantime, Russia controls the pipelines.
They do. They've got Nord Stream going right under the Baltic Sea to Germany. They've got Yamal going through Belarus to Poland and Germany. They've got Blue Stream going across the Black Sea to Turkey.
So they've got Europe surrounded.
Pretty much. And it's not just Europe. They're also looking to expand their influence in Asia.
Right. And they're working with China on a lot of those projects.
Exactly. It's a whole new geopolitical landscape taking shape.
Let's shift gears and talk about China for a bit.
All right, China. Another giant, shaped by its geography.
Their history is full of, invasions and humiliations by foreign powers.
Yeah, they've got a long memory. They haven't forgotten what it was like to be weak, to be at the mercy of others.
And that's shaped their worldview, hasn't it?
Absolutely. Like, the Communist Party, their whole narrative is about national rejuvenation, about making China strong again, about never being humiliated again, and security. That's a huge part of it. They're obsessed with secure borders.
And their borders, I mean, they're pretty impressive, aren't they?
Oh, yeah. They've got natural barriers. They've got strategic depth. It's a tough nut to crack. Let's start with the north. You've got Mongolia, right? And between China and Mongolia, you've got the Gobi Desert.
Right.
It's huge. It's harsh. It's empty. Not exactly ideal for a military invasion.
Not ideal at all.
But it's good for trade. Mongolia has resources that China needs, and the Gobi isn't stopping that.
Right. So it's a barrier to invasion, but not to commerce. So
Interesting. It is. Then you've got the West, Xinjiang, and Tibet. That's where things get a little more complicated.
those are sensitive areas, right?
Very sensitive. You've got mountains, you've got high plateaus. It's a tough terrain to control, but it's also strategically important. It's a buffer zone. It gives China access to Central Asia. It's got resources.
And they've been moving a lot of Han Chinese into those areas, haven't they?
Yeah, they have. Trying to, solidify their control, dilute the local populations, but it's causing a lot of tension.
It's created a lot of unrest, a lot of resentment.
Yeah. And it's a real challenge for the Chinese government. They need to keep control of these areas for security reasons, for economic reasons, but they got to do it in a way that doesn't backfire.
They're walking a tightrope.
They are. Then you've got the East and the South, where it gets even more interesting. That's where China's ambitions really start to show.
They're building up their navy, making claims in the South China Sea.
Mm-hmm.
You-
Want to be a major maritime power.
And that brings them into conflict with pretty much everyone.
Yeah. You've got Japan in the East China Sea. They've got this dispute over some gas deposits. And then there's the whole air defense identification zone thing.
Right, where China basically said, this is our airspace and you need our permission to fly here, which didn't go over very well.
Not at all. Then you've got Taiwan, the big one. It's an island, but it's strategically crucial. China claims it as their own, but it's a democracy, and it's got a close relationship with the U.S.
And the U.S. has made it clear that they'll defend Taiwan if China attacks.
Yeah, it's a potential flashpoint. And then you've got the South China Sea, super important for trade. And China's been building islands, claiming territory, militarizing the whole area.
They're really trying to assert their dominance there.
They are. They see it as their backyard, their sphere of influence. But other countries, like the Philippines and Vietnam, they're not happy about it. And the U.S. is pushing back, too. They're doing freedom of navigation operations, sending warships through the area to show that they don't recognize China's claims.
So it's a real powder keg.
It is, and it's all because of geography.
And China's influence isn't just limited to their region either, is it?
Nope. They're going global. They're investing in Africa. They're building ports and railroads all over the place. They're securing resources everywhere they can. It's a new kind of empire, an economic empire.
And that's going to have huge geopolitical implications.
Huge. It's already changing the balance of power in the world.
All right, let's talk about another continent that's been really shaped by its geography, both physically and politically. Africa.
Africa. Man, it's such a diverse continent, so much history, so much potential. But geography has really been a mixed bag for them.
In what way?
Well, for starters, their coastline, not a lot of natural harbors, makes it hard to develop, sea trade, which is
Yeah.
how a lot of countries get rich.
That makes sense.
And then you've got the rivers. They're big, they're powerful, but they're not that great for transportation. Lots of waterfalls, rapids, that kind of thing. Makes it hard to move goods around. And the continent itself, it's huge, like way bigger than people realize.
Yeah, those Mercator maps really distort things, don't they?
They do. Africa looks way smaller on those maps than it actually is. And for a long time, it was really isolated from the rest of the world. Like, you've got the Sahara Desert in the north, huge barrier. And then you've got the oceans on all the other sides. So they didn't have as much contact with Europe and Asia, which meant they missed out on a lot of the technological advancements that were happening over there.
Right, so they were kind of left behind.
Yeah, in a lot of ways. And then you've got the colonial legacy. The European powers came in, they drew borders that made no sense, they divided up ethnic groups, they exploited resources, and they left behind a whole mess of problems.
Yeah, and I mean, those colonial borders, they were just lines on a map, weren't they? They didn't take into account, the people who actually live there.
Exactly, and it's still causing problems today. You've got countries with multiple ethnic groups that don't get along. You've got resources that are concentrated in one area leading to conflict. It's a real challenge.
Yeah, and even water, which you'd think would be abundant in some parts of Africa, could be a source of conflict.
Yeah, like in the Nile River, Egypt relies on it for like everything. But now Ethiopia is building this huge dam upstream, and Egypt's worried that it's going to reduce their water supply.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And then you've got oil. Nigeria's got tons of it, but it's all concentrated in the south, and the north feels left out, which leads to resentment and conflict.
So these geographical realities, you just create all these layers of complexity.
They do. And then you've got China coming in, investing in infrastructure, extracting resources.
China's everywhere these days.
They are. And it's a mixed bag. Like, on the one hand, it's bringing in investment, it's creating jobs. But on the other hand, it's also creating new dependencies, new
It's
challenges.
like Africa's stuck between a rock and a hard place.
It is. They need to develop, they need to grow their economies, but they've got to do it in a way that benefits their people, not just foreign powers. And geography plays a huge role in all of this.
Okay, let's talk about a region that's been in the news a lot lately, the Middle East.
The Middle East, land of ancient history, vibrant cultures, and sadly, a whole lot of conflict.
And a lot of that conflict, it goes back to, well, lines on a map.
Lines on a map drawn by people who didn't really understand or care about the people who actually live there.
The legacy of colonialism.
Yeah. Like after World War I, the European powers carved up the Ottoman Empire. And they drew these borders that were like totally arbitrary. They didn't take into account the different ethnic groups, the different religious sects.
Sunnis, Shias, Kurds, all lumped together in ways that made no sense.
Yeah. And that created a lot of the problems we see today.
Right. Like you've got Iraq, for example.
Yeah.
It's this artificial country, right? It's made up of three very different regions, each with its own history and its own identity.
You've got the Sunni Arabs in the west, the Shia Arabs in the east, and the Kurds in the north. And they've never really gotten along.
And that's led to a lot of violence, a lot of instability.
It has. And it's not just Iraq. You see similar problems in Syria, in Lebanon, in Yemen. It's like